You're listening to the ProcureTech podcast, your weekly show for all that's cooking in the digital procurement space. Yes, we've got the hottest startups, thought leadership, and conversation from visionary industry experts, and definitely no stiff corporate content. I'm your host, James Meads, Procurement Pro, Digital Nomad, and ProcureTech fanboy. And now, here's this week's show. Yes, hello there, greetings, and welcome to another episode of the show. I'm glad to have you with me on this fine day where we're going to talk with another founder and CEO of a very, very innovative, fantastic procurement tech solution out there that only started last year actually, but is growing rapidly. Before we do that, just want to give you a quick heads up that I recently have launched a monthly newsletter with the ProcureTech podcast, where every month I'm going to be giving you a summary of everything that's been happening in the digital procurement space during that period, and also thankfully collaborating with some great influencers and industry experts in this space to give me their snippets and nuggets of gold from their bank of knowledge to help me share that with you too. If you want to get a piece of the action, then just head over to procuretechpodcast.com/newsletter, sign up there, and we will bring you that goodness once a month to your inbox. So on with today's show. And with that, I'm very, very pleased to welcome today's guest onto the show. We're going to be talking all about tail spend, and specifically how we can improve the efficiency and effectiveness of procurement and free up some valuable time and resource in how we manage non-strategic spend. So to discuss tail spend, I would like to offer a very warm welcome to the ProcureTech podcast to Henning Hatje, CEO and co-founder of Lhotse. Henning, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, James. Thanks for having me today.
It's a pleasure. So before we kick off, maybe just very, very briefly, introduce Lhotse to the audience, because you're a pretty new company. So I'm guessing there's quite a lot of people out there that maybe haven't heard of what you're doing.
Yes, absolutely. So Lhotse is a ProcureTech venture that we started in 2020, and we're focused on optimizing, i.e. automating tactical spend for large corporations and for mid-sized companies. And what we do in essence is we automate the supplier identification and approach processes and help companies to kind of bring tactical spend, as it is in an unmanaged form in many companies today, under control.
That's awesome. Thank you very much. And we're going to have a good discussion around tactical spend today and some of the different approaches to it, what works and what doesn't, and some of the problems that can be encountered all around managing non-strategic or tactical spend. So pretty obviously it may seem, but tactical spend is very likely to be the next big focus for procurement and for the business at large, simply because it's been neglected by many organizations for so long, with a big focus on, the 80% that drives the results. But now, it's getting to the point that companies are having to be ever leaner and do everything cheaper, smarter, better. And this is now starting to come into focus, especially when you consider looking at the recent Deloitte CPO survey that highlighted that procurement leaders or CPOs' top priority over the next 12 months was going to be operational effectiveness. I think this really plays to that point in terms of really tackling what takes up a lot of procurement professionals' time. So let's start off with, how would you define tactical spend? And is it synonymous with tail spend? Or is one of them describing repeatable versus non-repeatable spend, or spend that's managed by procurement versus sort of maverick or uncontrolled spend? Just break it down a little bit for me, how you would see it was the definition.
In my view, there are probably many ways to define it, and arguably there's probably no correct or by the books way, as in many terms in procurement. For us at Lhotse, we see tactical spend in many cases as non-managed spend. So that is not managed by the procurement teams, especially or particularly not actively. And hence it would usually fall through and stay somewhat unnoticed and unoptimized within an organization. In many cases that we see it, or how we define it, it's mostly indirect in nature, though we also see it in categories that are close to production or close to strategic or direct spend, for example, in MRO. Tactical spend versus tail spend, I would say if they were both depicted on a Venn diagram, they do have some overlap. In the tail spend world, in our view, you also have some parts of catalog spend, which is, in our view, not part of tactical spend. At least that's not how we see it. And I would say the hardest definition that an organization implicitly can have, by which they define tail spend, is kind of the thresholds that they use. For example, if they decide upon how many offers you would need for a certain requisition, if it's 1 versus 3, for example, or if certain suppliers are allowed to be included in a request or not, for example, only preferred suppliers.
And I think that leads very nicely on to the next question that I wanted to ask, because when you have a policy of only involving procurement professionals for purchase requisitions above a certain threshold, or when you have a competitive bidding policy that says that you have to typically go out and get 3 offers under certain circumstances, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that there is a lot of untapped opportunity for everything that falls under that threshold if you're not doing that for spend that falls below it. And I understand why companies have this. You know, there's a finite amount of resource, and you get then to the law of diminishing returns that, you know, it's going to be a similar amount of workload to purchase something that costs $1 million or euro versus something that costs 10,000. But, you know, there is always opportunity there, and it's a huge area that is untapped at the moment. I mean, your background actually is consulting, and you're a former consultant for a top tier firm. So perhaps you can share some of your experiences that you've seen out there in the field of the different procurement policies that exist for non-strategic spend. And I guess the second part of that would be, if companies are not managing this themselves, then what other solutions have there been out there to do that? I'm thinking specifically business process outsourcing. You're using integrators on categories like MRO, and where do you see the pros and cons of those compared to using software?
Absolutely. So from my previous experience, and as always, I would say there's a spectrum with 2 extremes. That's at least what I witnessed during my time at Boston Consulting Group. I would put that on 2 dimensions, actually. So the first one is spend thresholds that an organization theoretically sets in their processes. In essence, below which threshold they allow for tactical spend to exist. In that sense that you only need 1 offer, for example, or that you can just buy what you want, spoken in a very colloquial way. The second dimension is a bit softer, namely, I would call it the diligence with which a policy is enforced. And also here you have 2 ends. This is obviously, this has not only to do with the perception and mandate of the procurement function internally, but also with the man or women power of that function, how much power and capacity they actually have to enforce the policies they've been setting for the organization. In terms of the thresholds, we've seen both. We've seen very cost-conscious companies that require 3 offers, for example, for anything that is even above 5,000 euros. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there are companies that don't mind anything below 100K to be sourced with a single non-negotiated offer. I would say pharma, pharma is one of the examples where we have seen this. It's just not that relevant in their perspective with the long R&D cycle.
Because they make far too much money, right?
I wouldn't put it that way, but just in terms of the budgets they're having on their R&D projects, let's put it that way, they have other priorities. So I would say the story changes a bit though when you add this enforcement or this diligence dimension that I mentioned before, especially in those firms that have rather strict thresholds. So, which we believe is in theory a great thing. usually tend to be rather lavish with their enforcement. And that's actually for rather obvious reasons. More events fall within the range. So more events to be handled, to approve, to checked. But there's usually no capacity to do that extra work. When sizing the procurement function, that bit was, well, obviously sometimes overlooked. And then paired with legacy tools, these organizations are actually usually not in the position to even follow up on their own policies. Just as an example, the tip of the iceberg that I witnessed was with an organization that operates in a very, very cost-conscious industry, and one of the most cost-conscious industries in the travel industry, or airlines, to be specific. And they actually had a few purchases of more than 100,000 euros that were not sourced using several competitive offers, just one, where there was obvious savings potential was lying around. And in my view, people, not just procurement managers, but also within the functional areas of the business, should have been aware of that at the moment. And to answer your second question, or to elaborate a bit on the topic of what other options or what ways are there to handle tail or tactical spend, however we want to define it now. Yes, business process outsourcing is, I think, has for long been quite accepted practice, and it still is, certainly today. In our view, though, this is a bit, it's kind of an outdated format for many firms. First of all, because the message that you send internally, in my view, is not the greatest, that you outsource just certain parts of the activities, especially if there's actually value in these activities as well for the organization. And the second is that by now, and that probably leads us to the discussion about technology later on, by now there are different ways that you can use. I don't want to say better ways than BPO, because you get your results with BPO, but there are different ways that you can enable your own organization to do those things semi-automatically, let's say, using data and using novel solutions that help you automate parts of these processes.
And that also then means that you don't have to have a team managing and looking at due diligence and compliance of your BPO provider as well, which I suspect is another obvious advantage or cost saving of doing that.
Correct. And you would kind of shift the skill set, or the skill set of the people that you would have in such a function away from compliance and governance of the BPO over to actually selecting tools, selecting technology providers, calibrating those technologies, and setting policies and kind of benchmarks and boundaries for the tools and for the people to operate in those tools or using those tools.
So just a quick interlude to make you aware of a couple of things that we want to bring to you in the digital procurement space. So first of all, if you'd like to get all of the latest news on all things in the ProcureTech space, then just head over to procuretechpodcast.com/newsletter, where we will bring you a monthly summary of everything that's happening, along with thoughts and contributions from industry experts. And if you're actually ready to take action and you want some one-on-one advice on the best digital procurement solutions that are out there to solve your unique challenges in your business, then just go to bookme.name/James Meads to arrange a free 30-minute one-on-one consultation with me, so as I can learn more about your business and the right digital procurement solutions that can solve your problems. And now, let's jump right back into the show. And one advantage of using technology is that you've already got in your organization the existing data in your ERP system, assuming we're talking about mid to large to enterprise level businesses that would be running an ERP system. So you've got historical data. So how can you use that data that's already there to simplify or to semi-automate the procurement process on non-strategic or tactical requisitions, and what does that data usually reveal that can then drive the benefits that a solution like Lhotse, which you've designed, can deliver as hard benefits to an organization?
I would say that you can use it for two primary use cases. There are certainly more, but those are the ones that come to mind. One way is to integrate that kind of data in a simple and relevant way into existing processes. So in that way, you can, for example, you can give relevant recommendations as to which suppliers are suitable for certain requisitions and should be considered based on internal data points from historical purchases, and also based on external additional data points that providers such as Lhotse can add to those or can integrate into those processes and add to the workflows of the users. Another way is to use the data points to identify consolidation potential, for example, in your non-strategic supplier base. This is usually a classic procurement consulting work project, I would say. But today, you don't necessarily need a whole team of consultants for that anymore, at least not in many cases. In essence, software and trained algorithms that understand what's in your supplier base can help you identify, for example, unnecessary redundancies in your supplier base. Again, based on historical purchases and the data points that you have within your firm on your firm suppliers, you can use those to make analyses on redundancies that are actually not required and hinder your business. And then you can, in the end, use these analyses to run, for example, tenders, to do framework contracts with only a few suppliers, a few then more strategic suppliers for certain items.
Yeah, and as someone who's done that activity manually, not as a consultant, but as an employee who's been focused on regional procurement of MRO across a number of different factories, I definitely see what that value proposition could be in terms of, being able to get the user, i.e. the category manager, to the decision point much faster than doing it manually with an ERP system and Excel. Yeah, definitely. So other than what you mentioned around consolidation and acknowledging that many of the activities are repetitive and the processes are similar regardless what company you look at for tail spend or tactical spend, what other areas of the source to pay cycle on tactical spend do you see as being relatively easy or practical to automate, aside from what's already been done in some of the source to pay procurement tech? What else can Lhotse bring to that to that sort of part of the business other than what's already out there as established solutions?
Yeah, so first and foremost, because this is what we actually do, we see it in supplier identification. There really is no need, in our view, that someone in the organization remember, for example, from last year or from back in the days, that there's this one supplier for ABC that they can deliver. That's something algorithms and machines can do today. And if they cannot do it 100%, they can at least guide you towards it and give you a good basis for your decision as a category manager or even as a requester somewhere in the business unit. I also believe that the requisitioning process itself has a high potential for at least the semi-automation. This is likely the most interesting application of automation, in my view, in terms of the interplay between humans and technology. You can, if you kind of think this through, there can be you can enable as a software provider, you can enable people in organizations to be much more efficient and also effective in the way they request something, because they get smart suggestions based on historical data, but also based on external data points that we can add and enrich in the requisitioning process when someone defines their request. These, in my view, are two of the most obvious or two of the most relevant activities.
So what we're saying then in simple terms is that it doesn't require historical knowledge or you're not at the mercy of having to try and pull that data out of an ERP system, which, let's face it, most procurement people don't really know how to use all of the functions in one of these big cumbersome ERP systems. So it brings all of that into a single source of truth, and also takes supplier communication outside of buyers' inboxes. So if they leave the company, for example, or they're off sick, or they're no longer there for whatever reason, that data is going to be accessible for posterity in one central system. So yeah, I can certainly see, as with all procurement tech, bringing it into that one central source of truth is naturally a big advantage when we think of how the future economy is going to be driven ever more by data. So with that in mind, and with all of the automation or semi-automation or time saving that tools like this can offer, what do you see ultimately then as being the end game for how tactical spend will be managed in future? I mean, do you think that will ultimately be managed a lot more by the requisitioners themselves? Do you see this moving to a more self-service procurement? Just taking the example of 30 years ago, when you went to put petrol in your car, there was probably a guy there that would help you put it in, whereas now everyone fills up their own car. Do you think that will be the trend?
Yes, and yes, in the mid to long run, I would say. So in the mid to long run, I see a fully autonomous procurement function when it comes to non-strategic spend. However, there will be two roles still in that procurement function. There will definitely someone who is a product or tool owner who makes sure that the right systems are in place and that they're functioning as expected, as defined by the business. And also there will be, let's just call him or her a policy owner who sets the frame in terms of the content, the strategy, the minimum requirements for suppliers, etc., so that the systems actually know how to behave and what to do. And the rest, I would actually say, yes, you had a nice example there, and I always like to take the IKEA example to offload it to the internal customer in that sense. That I believe will happen to the requisitioning process or in tactical spend, definitely. And however, in the short run, I definitely, or actually, see more resources going into procurement, not just to bring about this change, because this change will take some time and it will take effort in the functions to bring it about, but also in a more strategic sense, I would say. The procurement function deserves so much more attention in a company internal context than it's mostly given today. It's a bit like with, for example, compliance in the last decade, when money laundering, fraud, sanctions regimes were global topics of interest and that were ultimately then very, very crucial to handle for any organization. I see kind of the similar challenges or new challenges in a similar context now that are relevant to procurement, climate change, first and foremost, but also generally supply chain resilience. Procurement, in our view, is pretty much in the best spot in an organization to build a governance around these challenges, because so much of the transactions of an organization to the outside world go through this function. So yes, but ultimately, coming back to your question, I see that the requisitioners will do all the, let's say, operative work themselves.
And there were two great points that you made in that answer that I would really like to highlight, because I think they're so important to anyone that's having to or build or orchestrate a procurement team now going forward. Is that, number one, the move towards a more self-service model, and that you use the IKEA example, I think, is really touching, because generally speaking, people love IKEA. Yes, there are people that hate it and don't like the concept, but whenever you go to an IKEA store, it's always busy, right? So, I mean, it's such a hugely successful business that they're clearly doing something right. So I think that's improving the end customer experience. And if a requisitioner can go in and use something that looks and feels like an e-commerce store when they go into it, and they don't have to have the pain point of contacting a procurement person who in reality probably doesn't want to go out and buy something tactically because it's not a very challenging piece of work. I think that from a stakeholder and procurement relationship perspective, that is really, really important. And you're absolutely right. I think procurement now has much bigger challenges in the wider world than doing day-to-day transactional and tactical procurement. And I think it will require a different type of procurement professional to perform that role. But ultimately, I truly believe that procurement as a department will come out of this with a much more upskilled team and a much more professional team, because those new activities and responsibilities that are coming into procurement, you're right, with procurement being essentially the fulcrum of the whole supply chain when it comes to supplier and external vendor management, I think that will really elevate the function. But in order to do that, as you say, some of the more day-to-day mundane tactical work has to be automated or simplified or pushed onto the end user to enable them to self-serve their requirements. Yes. So my final question, Henning, is where do you feel the gaps are now in terms of user experience when it comes to things like tracking requisitions, acknowledgements, delivery dates, goods receipts? With Lhotse brings all of that into one place, doesn't it? So maybe just tell us a little bit about that before we sign off.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's definitely one of the key challenges, which is also one of the reasons why the space is so interesting and there's so much potential to aid the buying teams, but also the requisitioners. The gap exists, in our view at Lhotse, mostly because it takes too long to adapt or to change processes to new circumstances. Most of the processes that organizations use today are still made for like standardization, and they were built at a time when data and data insights didn't really play a role in these processes. The input, in fact, was in 95% of the cases purely driven by the human behind the machine, which is great. But as we see today, there are more advanced technologies that can fuel these data right into the processes. And I guess you've experienced this yourself in the past. It just takes a lot of time and willpower before an organization is ready for a change and to adjust a process that has been there or been around for quite a while. But that's exactly what we need, I think, less process or new processes that accommodate for these abilities for data analyses that we have today. And yeah, that's kind of an issue still, in my view, that the user experience and mostly the user experience is just not intuitive, and it's not fun to use technology in a corporate context today, even today in 2021. It was neglected for quite a long time. The user experience in B2B environments has so much potential. And we were wondering, especially in the last 2 years when we were designing Lhotse and starting the whole project, why does no one seem to care about creating a software experience in B2B that users actually enjoy? People spend so much time during their day in front of these systems, and still most of them still look like and feel like, also when you use them, when you jump through the process steps and back and forth, like they were built in the last century.
Yeah, I mean, I see maybe there are more and more companies doing this now, but you're right that we're still very, very much on the left-hand side of the bell curve, and maybe I'm just in my own sort of little world in my echo chamber because I talk to so many people like yourself. But when you go into the wider world, there are a lot of organizations that are still using Excel, SharePoint, and an ERP system as their digital procurement tools. So yeah, I think the overwhelming majority are still at that phase. Yeah. So final question, Henning: if anyone would like to learn more about Lhotse or maybe see a demonstration of the software, what's the best way that they can get in touch with you?
The easiest way is definitely to just send me a message on LinkedIn, or send me an email. We're always monitoring our emails, obviously, and we can definitely set up a call within a few days and give anyone interested a live demo and discuss if tactical spend is a challenge for their organization, or just brainstorm a bit on the future of procurement.
Excellent. Thank you very much for joining me. It's been a pleasure to have you and learn more about your solution. And yeah, keep in touch and good luck with your growth, because you recently got funding and I hear you're growing pretty quickly at the moment.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much, James. It was fun speaking with you, and keep in touch.
Will do. Thank you. So as Henning alluded to in that interview, freeing up your resources so as they can spend time on what's going to be a critical requirement for procurement teams going forward is really the biggest USP that he can give to try and sell his software. So thank you once again for listening to the Procure Tech podcast. I know that there are a lot of other podcasts out there these days in the procurement space, so I'm very grateful that you've chosen to insert me into your earballs on this fine day. If you like the show, then don't forget, please subscribe in your favorite podcast directory, and even better, leave us a review if you like what you hear, so as we can reach more people with our content. Follow the LinkedIn page to get recent updates from us. And until then, I will see you next week with another great show. Bye for now.